On the 15th of March 1944, Convoy HI-72 steamed northward through the Philippine Sea, 38 merchant vessels carrying rubber, oil, and rice from Singapore to Tokyo. Captain Tanaka Yoshiro stood on the bridge of the convoy's lead escort destroyer, scanning horizons he believed were empty. The convoy commander's confidence stemmed from a simple calculation. American submarines operated alone, and with proper zigzagging and escort screening, the odds favored the convoy's survival. Japanese naval doctrine had concluded that the vast Pacific was too immense for coordinated submarine attacks, that the Americans lacked the communication systems and tactical discipline to hunt together like wolves. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Captain Tanaka could not have imagined was that beneath the waves, 6 American submarines were already converging on his position, communicating through coded messages, positioning themselves like chess pieces around his convoy, preparing to demonstrate that Japanese assumptions about submarine warfare were catastrophically wrong. 300 miles to the east, aboard the submarine USS Seahorse, Commander Slade Cutter stood in the cramped conning tower, reviewing the latest intelligence dispatch. The message had arrived just after dawn, decoded by the submarine's radio man from the stream of encrypted transmissions that now flowed constantly between American submarines and their headquarters in Pearl Harbor. The dispatch contained precise information: convoy designation, composition, speed, heading, and predicted position. This intelligence came from sources the Japanese never suspected, from codebreakers who had penetrated deep into Japanese naval communications, providing American submarine commanders with information that transformed submarine warfare from a game of chance into a coordinated hunt. Commander Cutter marked the convoy's projected course on his navigation chart, then composed his own message to the other submarines that were already moving into position. The radio man encrypted the message using the latest cipher system, transmitted it in a brief burst that lasted only seconds, then shut down to avoid detection. Within the hour, 5 other submarine commanders would receive identical information, would calculate their own intercept courses, would begin the careful choreography of positioning themselves around a convoy that still believed it was safe. The transformation of American submarine warfare from individual hunters to coordinated packs had taken nearly 3 years of painful learning. In the early months following Pearl Harbor, American submarines operated exactly as the Japanese expected, alone and often ineffectively. Faulty torpedoes plagued the submarine force, with Mark 14 torpedoes running too deep, failing to explode, or circling back toward their launching submarines. Cautious commanders approached targets timidly, fired from extreme range, then retreated without confirming results. By the end of 1942, the American submarine force had managed to sink only 180 Japanese merchant vessels, barely scratching the surface of Japan's merchant fleet. But beneath this disappointing performance, systematic changes were already beginning. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who assumed command of the Pacific Submarine Force in February 1943, attacked every problem with methodical determination. He forced the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge and fix the torpedo problems, firing test torpedoes into nets to prove they ran too deep, conducting live tests against cliffs to demonstrate faulty magnetic exploders. He replaced cautious commanders with aggressive hunters, men like Dudley Morton, Sam Dealey, and Richard O'Kane, who understood that submarines succeeded through boldness rather than timidity. Most critically, he began implementing coordinated tactics that transformed submarines from lone wolves into hunting packs. The concept of wolf pack tactics was not new. German U-boats in the Atlantic had demonstrated their effectiveness, with multiple submarines coordinating attacks against Allied convoys, overwhelming escort vessels through simultaneous approaches from different directions. But implementing similar tactics in the Pacific presented unique challenges. The Atlantic was relatively compact, with convoy routes confined to well-defined sea lanes between America and Britain. The Pacific sprawled across nearly 64 million square miles, with convoy routes scattered across vast distances. German U-boats operated within a few hundred miles of their bases, allowing commanders to coordinate personally with headquarters. American submarines operated thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor, requiring them to coordinate independently through radio communications that risked detection. The distances were so extreme that submarines often spent 3 weeks simply transiting to their patrol areas, had only 4 to 6 weeks on station before fuel and provisions ran low, then required another 3 weeks to return home. Despite these challenges, American submarine commanders began developing tactics specifically designed for Pacific conditions. Tactics that would exploit the one overwhelming advantage they possessed: information. The intelligence advantage that American submarines enjoyed stemmed from one of the greatest cryptographic achievements of the conflict. At Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes, allowing them to read Japanese convoy routing orders almost as quickly as Japanese convoy commanders received them. These decrypted messages revealed departure times, routes, compositions, and speeds of merchant convoys, transforming submarine operations from random searches into targeted intercepts. The intelligence flowed through a carefully orchestrated system. Cryptanalysts at Pearl Harbor decrypted Japanese convoy orders. Analysts correlated this information with radio direction finding and other intelligence sources. Then submarine headquarters transmitted targeting information to submarines in appropriate patrol areas. Submarine commanders received these messages encoded in American ciphers, providing them with information the Japanese never suspected was compromised. By early 1944, this intelligence system had become so refined that American submarines routinely waited along convoy routes like predators at watering holes, knowing exactly when their prey would arrive. But intelligence alone was insufficient. Coordinating multiple submarines required communication systems that allowed commanders to share tactical information while minimizing their own vulnerability to detection. American submarines used a combination of long and short-wave radio transmissions, broadcasting brief encrypted messages that other submarines could receive, but the Japanese direction finders struggled to locate. The brevity of these transmissions was critical. A submarine would surface after dark, raise its radio antenna, transmit a coded message lasting only 10 to 20 seconds, then submerge immediately. These transmissions contained position reports, contact information, and tactical intentions, allowing other submarines to coordinate without lengthy radio conversations that would reveal their positions. The encryption systems used were constantly updated, with new cipher keys distributed regularly to prevent Japanese codebreakers from penetrating American communications. This secure communication network transformed isolated submarines into coordinated hunting groups that could concentrate overwhelming force against individual convoys. The tactics themselves evolved through experimentation and combat experience. Early Wolfpack operations simply positioned multiple submarines along a convoy's expected route, hoping one would make contact, then alert others to converge. These primitive tactics achieved limited success, with submarines often arriving too late or positioning themselves poorly for effective attacks. By mid-1944, tactics had become far more sophisticated. A typical Wolfpack consisted of 3 to 6 submarines, each assigned specific sectors around the convoy's projected course. The first submarine to make contact, designated the attack coordinator, would shadow the convoy, transmitting regular position reports, while other pack members maneuvered into optimal attack positions. The coordinator timed the attack so that multiple submarines struck simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming escort vessels that could not defend against threats from multiple vectors. After the initial attack, submarines would reload torpedoes while remaining in contact, then launch subsequent strikes as opportunities developed. These coordinated attacks could continue for days, with submarines pursuing convoys across hundreds of miles, launching multiple strikes that progressively destroyed the convoy's merchant vessels while avoiding counterattacks from increasingly disorganized escorts. Commander Cutter aboard USS Seahorse represented the new breed of submarine commander that these tactics required. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1935, spent years in surface vessels before volunteering for submarine duty, and commanded his first submarine in early 1943. His approach to submarine warfare combined mathematical precision with aggressive tactics. He calculated torpedo firing solutions with slide rule accuracy, positioned his submarine with geometric precision, fired full spreads of torpedoes to maximize hit probability, then followed up with surface gun attacks against damaged vessels. His crew had developed absolute confidence in his judgment, understanding that his careful calculations and bold execution consistently achieved results while minimizing risk. In previous patrols, Seahorse had accounted for 19 confirmed merchant vessels, making Cutter one of the most successful submarine commanders in the Pacific. Now, as he maneuvered toward the intercept point for Convoy HI-72, he was preparing to demonstrate how coordinated tactics could multiply individual effectiveness. The other submarines converging on Convoy HI-72 each brought unique capabilities and experienced commanders. USS Rasher, commanded by Commander Willard Laughlin, had recently completed modifications that increased her torpedo capacity and improved her radar systems. USS Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, was one of the newest submarines in the fleet, incorporating lessons learned from 3 years of combat. USS Pampanito, USS Steelhead, and USS Pache rounded out the pack, each commanded by veterans who understood both the technical capabilities of their vessels and the tactical doctrine that transformed individual submarines into coordinated hunting groups. Together, these 6 submarines carried 96 torpedoes, mounted 30 deck guns, and represented the accumulated experience of dozens of combat patrols. Against a Japanese convoy doctrine that still assumed submarines operated alone, they constituted overwhelming force. The Japanese convoy commander, Captain Tanaka, had based his defensive arrangements on assumptions that were already obsolete. His 4 escort destroyers maintained a diamond formation around the merchant vessels, with 1 destroyer ahead, 1 astern, and 1 on each flank. This formation effectively screened against individual submarine attacks, forcing any submarine to penetrate the escort screen before reaching the merchant vessels. Japanese anti-submarine tactics emphasized aggressive counterattacks. When escorts detected a submarine, they would immediately charge toward the contact, launching depth charges, while other escorts maintained their screening positions. This doctrine had proven effective against individual submarines, which typically broke off attacks when faced with aggressive escorts. But the doctrine assumed submarines operated alone, that defeating one attacker eliminated the threat to the convoy. Against coordinated attacks from multiple directions, the defensive formation became a liability, forcing escorts to choose which threat to counter, while leaving other approaches undefended. The convoy's merchant vessels themselves represented critical resources for the Japanese military economy. The 38 ships included tankers carrying petroleum from the Dutch East Indies, freighters loaded with rubber and tin from Malaya, and grain ships transporting rice from Indochina. Japan's industrial production depended absolutely on these maritime supply lines. The home islands lacked virtually all strategic raw materials, requiring imports of petroleum, iron ore, bauxite, rubber, and food. Every ton of oil refined in Japanese factories, every aircraft assembled in Japanese plants, every rifle manufactured in Japanese arsenals depended on raw materials that arrived by sea. The Japanese had begun the conflict with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping, calculated to be barely sufficient for maintaining both military operations and civilian economy. By March 1944, submarine attacks had already reduced this tonnage by more than 40%. Forcing increasingly difficult choices between military requirements and civilian needs. Each convoy that reached port safely was celebrated as a strategic victory. Each convoy destroyed represented not just the immediate loss of ships and cargo, but the progressive strangulation of Japan's capacity to continue fighting. On the 16th of March, USS Seahorse made first contact with Convoy HI-72. Commander Cutter had positioned his submarine along the convoy's projected track, running submerged during daylight hours to avoid detection by Japanese patrol aircraft. At 1400 hours, the submarine's radar operator detected surface contacts at 28,000 yards, multiple vessels in formation consistent with a large convoy. Cutter raised the periscope for a quick observation, confirming the contact as Convoy HI-72, then immediately transmitted a contact report to the other pack members. The encrypted message contained convoy position, heading, speed, and composition, allowing other submarines to calculate intercept courses. Cutter then began the careful process of shadowing the convoy, maintaining contact while avoiding detection, waiting for darkness when the pack could coordinate its attack. The other submarines received Seahorse's contact report and began maneuvering into attack positions. USS Tang, the fastest of the group, raced ahead to position herself directly in the convoy's path. USS Rasher moved to intercept from the port side, while USS Pampanito approached from starboard. USS Steelhead and USS Parsh positioned themselves astern, ready to pursue if the convoy altered course to evade. This positioning took hours of careful navigation, with each submarine calculating courses that would place them in optimal attack position when darkness fell. The submarines communicated through brief radio transmissions, coordinating their movements to ensure they approached simultaneously rather than sequentially. By nightfall, 6 submarines had surrounded Convoy HI-72 in a formation the Japanese escorts could neither detect nor defend against. The attack began at 2200 hours. Commander O'Kane aboard USS Tang struck first, firing 6 torpedoes at 3 large tankers in the convoy's center. The torpedoes ran true, striking 2 tankers that immediately erupted in flames as petroleum ignited. Within minutes, both tankers were blazing wrecks, their fires illuminating the entire convoy. The Japanese escort commander reacted exactly as doctrine prescribed, ordering the nearest destroyer to charge toward Tang's position, while other escorts maintained their screening stations. But before the destroyer could reach Tang, Commander Laufon aboard USS Rasher launched his own attack from the opposite side of the convoy, firing 4 torpedoes at freighters silhouetted against the burning tankers. 3 torpedoes struck home, sinking 2 freighters and damaging a third. Now the escort commander faced impossible choices: pursue Tang, counterattack Rasher, or maintain the defensive screen. While he hesitated, Commander Cutter aboard USS Seahorse fired from yet another direction, his torpedoes striking a large transport that carried both troops and supplies. The transport began settling immediately, listing heavily to port as water flooded through torpedo holes. The Japanese escorts attempted to respond, but found themselves overwhelmed by attacks from multiple directions. When one destroyer charged toward a submarine contact, it exposed other approaches to attack. When escorts dropped depth charges, submarines simply moved away, then repositioned for new attacks. The burning tankers eliminated any concealment darkness might have provided, silhouetting merchant vessels perfectly for torpedo attacks. Over the next 3 hours, American submarines launched repeated strikes, methodically working through the convoy's merchant vessels. Each submarine fired, reloaded, repositioned, and fired again, maintaining constant pressure that prevented escorts from organizing effective counterattacks. By dawn, Convoy HI-72 had lost 14 merchant vessels destroyed, and 6 more damaged so severely they would never reach port. The remaining ships scattered in panic, abandoning formation to flee independently, making themselves even more vulnerable to submarine attacks. Captain Tanaka aboard the lead escort destroyer watched his convoy disintegrate with growing horror. He had never encountered anything like this coordinated assault, had no doctrine for defending against simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. His radio messages to headquarters grew increasingly desperate, reporting submarine contacts in every direction, describing attacks that overwhelmed his defenses. But headquarters could provide no meaningful assistance. Japanese anti-submarine forces were already stretched desperately thin, with escort destroyers needed for dozens of convoy routes across the Pacific. Aircraft that might have provided air cover were unavailable, either destroyed in previous battles or committed to defensive operations elsewhere. The Japanese had built their entire maritime defense strategy around the assumption that submarines operated individually, that proper escort tactics could defend against isolated attacks. Now that assumption was proving catastrophically wrong, and there existed no reserve forces to correct the error. The submarines pursued the scattered remnants of Convoy HI-72 for 2 more days, hunting down individual merchant vessels that had fled the main attack. USS Parsh intercepted a tanker attempting to reach Manila, firing 3 torpedoes that left the vessel blazing. USS Steelhead caught 2 freighters heading for a small port on Luzon's coast, destroying both with deck gunfire to conserve torpedoes. By the time the hunt concluded, Convoy HI-72 had ceased to exist as a functional unit. Of 38 merchant vessels that departed Singapore, only 11 reached Japanese ports, and most of those arrived damaged. The submarines had expended 62 torpedoes and several hundred rounds of deck gun ammunition to achieve this result, a remarkable economy of force that demonstrated how effectively intelligence and coordination multiplied combat effectiveness. The destruction of Convoy HI-72 represented just one engagement in what would become the most devastating campaign against merchant shipping in naval history. Throughout 1944, American submarines would conduct hundreds of similar attacks, progressively destroying the maritime transportation network that sustained Japanese military operations. The statistics told a story of systematic destruction that no amount of Japanese courage or determination could overcome. In January 1944, American submarines had accounted for 37 Japanese merchant vessels. By December, that monthly total had increased to 73 vessels, despite the fact that fewer Japanese ships remained to be targeted. The cumulative losses staggered comprehension. During 1944, American submarines would account for more than 600 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling approximately 2.7 million tons of shipping, and when combined with losses from aircraft, mines, and surface vessels, Japanese merchant shipping losses for the year would exceed 1,000 vessels totaling more than 4 million tons. The impact of these losses rippled through every aspect of Japanese military and economic capability. Petroleum imports declined from nearly 50 million barrels in 1943 to barely 20 million barrels in 1944, forcing severe rationing that limited training for pilots, restricted naval operations, and curtailed industrial production. Iron ore imports collapsed from more than 3 million tons to fewer than 1 million tons, creating shortages that forced aircraft manufacturers to substitute inferior materials that compromised performance. Food imports declined so severely that civilian rations were reduced to starvation levels, with urban populations receiving fewer than 1,500 calories per day. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures, none of which proved effective against coordinated submarine attacks. They organized larger convoys with stronger escorts, but this simply concentrated targets for submarine wolf packs, while reducing the frequency of supply deliveries. They routed convoys closer to coastlines, where air cover might provide protection, but American submarines simply waited offshore, intercepting convoys as they entered or departed ports. They attempted to replace merchant shipping losses through accelerated construction programs, but could not overcome the fundamental mathematics. American submarines were destroying merchant vessels far faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The submarine campaign's effectiveness stemmed from the convergence of multiple advantages the Japanese forces could not counter. American industrial capacity produced submarines at an accelerating rate, with new construction providing not just replacements for losses, but steady expansion of the submarine fleet. By mid-1944, the Pacific Submarine Force numbered more than 150 submarines, enough to maintain constant patrols across all major convoy routes. American torpedoes, finally reliable after years of problems, hit with devastating effect, requiring only 1 or 2 hits to sink most merchant vessels. American radar allowed submarines to track convoys in complete darkness, launching night attacks when Japanese escorts operated blind. Most critically, the intelligence advantage provided by code breaking meant that American submarines consistently positioned themselves along convoy routes, transforming what should have been random encounters into calculated ambushes. For individual submariners, the campaign combined periods of intense action with long stretches of tedium and discomfort. Submarines operated submerged during daylight hours to avoid detection by aircraft, running on battery power that limited speed and required careful management. The crews endured tropical heat that turned submarines into floating ovens, with interior temperatures routinely exceeding 100 degrees and humidity making every surface slick with condensation. Fresh food lasted only a few days, after which the crew subsisted on canned goods and dried provisions. Fresh water was strictly rationed, allowing only brief showers every few days. The psychological pressure of spending weeks underwater, knowing that a single torpedo hit or depth charge could transform the submarine into a steel coffin, affected even the most experienced sailors. Yet morale remained extraordinarily high, sustained by the visible evidence of their effectiveness. Submarines returned from patrol with confirmed destruction numbers that left no doubt about their impact. Crew members understood that their work was directly degrading Japanese capacity to continue fighting, that every merchant vessel destroyed shortened the conflict's duration. The Japanese recognized submarine warfare's devastating impact, but lacked resources to counter it effectively. Their anti-submarine forces remained inadequate throughout the conflict, with escort destroyer production failing to keep pace with increasing demand. Japanese sonar technology lagged behind American developments, making submarine detection difficult. Japanese depth charges proved less effective than Allied equivalents, lacking sufficient explosive force or ideal sinking characteristics. Perhaps most critically, Japanese doctrine never fully adapted to the reality of coordinated submarine attacks. Even late in 1944, convoy defense tactics still assumed submarines operated individually, still organized defenses against sequential rather than simultaneous threats. When American submarines struck in coordinated packs, Japanese escorts found themselves using tactics designed for a different kind of warfare, tactics that proved hopelessly inadequate against the threat they actually faced. Commander Cutter returned USS Seahorse to Pearl Harbor in early May 1944 after completing one of the most successful patrols of the conflict. His submarine had participated in the destruction of Convoy HI-72, then proceeded to conduct independent operations that accounted for 6 additional merchant vessels. The patrol had lasted 58 days, during which Seahorse had traveled more than 11,000 miles, fired all 24 torpedoes, and never once been seriously threatened by Japanese counterattacks. Upon arrival, Cutter found Pearl Harbor transformed from the devastated base he had first seen after the initial Japanese attack. The harbor now bustled with activity, with submarines arriving and departing on regular schedules, support vessels providing maintenance and resupply, and headquarters staff coordinating operations across the entire Pacific. The submarine force had evolved from a small, experimental component of the fleet into a highly effective organization that was systematically dismantling Japanese maritime communications. During his debriefing, Cutter emphasized the effectiveness of coordinated tactics and the critical importance of intelligence in enabling those tactics. He noted that without precise convoy routing information, coordinating 6 submarines across hundreds of square miles of ocean would have been impossible. He described how secure communications allowed submarines to maintain tactical coordination without compromising their positions. He recommended refining the doctrine for Wolfpack operations, suggesting improvements in attack coordination and escort suppression. His observations, combined with similar reports from other submarine commanders, led to further evolution of submarine tactics that would make operations even more effective in the coming months. The other submariners who participated in the attack on Convoy HI-72 had similarly successful experiences. Commander O'Kane aboard USS Tang would continue his extraordinary run of success, ultimately accounting for more than 30 merchant vessels before Tang was lost in October 1944 under tragic circumstances, struck by one of her own torpedoes that circled back after a firing malfunction. Commander Lawfon aboard USS Rasher would conduct multiple patrols that established him among the most effective submarine commanders, with confirmed destruction, totals exceeding 150,000 tons of shipping. The success of these commanders and dozens of others like them created a culture within the submarine force that emphasized aggressive tactics, careful calculation, and mutual support. Submarine crews understood that their survival and success depended not just on individual skill, but on the effectiveness of the entire pack, on coordinated operations that multiplied individual capabilities. By September 1944, the campaign against Japanese merchant shipping had achieved results beyond even optimistic predictions. Japanese petroleum stockpiles had declined to critical levels, forcing suspension of training programs and reduction of operational tempo across all military services. Japanese industrial production was collapsing, with factories shutting down for lack of raw materials. Food shortages had reached crisis proportions, with civilian populations in major cities experiencing malnutrition. Japanese military forces deployed across the Pacific found themselves increasingly isolated, unable to receive reinforcements, supplies, or evacuation when positions became untenable. The Japanese attempted desperate measures to maintain maritime communications, including using submarines to transport critical supplies. But these efforts represented tiny percentages of the tonnage required to sustain military operations and civilian economy. The human dimension of this campaign manifested in thousands of individual tragedies. Japanese merchant sailors died by the thousands as their vessels were torpedoed, with survival often depending on luck rather than preparation or skill. Many vessels sank so quickly the crews had no opportunity to launch lifeboats, drowning within minutes as ships plunged beneath the waves. Those who did reach lifeboats often faced days or weeks adrift in the Pacific, enduring exposure, thirst, and sometimes shark attacks before reaching land or being rescued. The psychological toll on surviving merchant sailors became severe, with many refusing to sail again after surviving one torpedoing. Japanese authorities resorted to increasingly coercive measures to maintain merchant marine manning levels, essentially conscripting sailors who understood they were being sent on missions with minimal survival prospects. American submariners rarely witnessed these consequences directly. They observed the immediate results of their attacks, seeing vessels sink or burst into flames, but typically departed before survivors could be rescued or bodies recovered. This emotional distance made the campaign psychologically easier for submarine crews, allowing them to focus on the tactical and strategic aspects of their mission rather than dwelling on the human cost. Occasionally, circumstances forced more direct confrontation with these realities. After sinking vessels, submarines sometimes surfaced to rescue survivors, particularly if those survivors might possess useful intelligence. These encounters revealed the human face of maritime warfare, showing submariners the Japanese sailors who were simultaneously enemies and fellow seafarers. Most submarine commanders handled these encounters professionally, treating rescued prisoners humanely while maintaining security procedures. A few commanders struggled with the moral complexity of killing enemy sailors in combat, while simultaneously feeling responsibility for those who survived. The campaign's effectiveness rested ultimately on mathematical realities that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome. Japanese merchant marine capacity had declined from 6 million tons at the beginning of the conflict to fewer than 2 million tons by the end of 1944. American submarine numbers had simultaneously increased from fewer than 50 operational submarines to more than 150. This intersection of declining targets and increasing hunters meant that Japanese merchant vessels faced progressively worsening odds every time they departed port. Even if every Japanese escort destroyer performed perfectly, even if every Japanese merchant captain executed flawless evasive maneuvers, the numbers ensured systematic destruction. American submarines would continue to find convoys, would continue to coordinate attacks, would continue to sink vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The mathematics of maritime warfare had turned decisively against Japanese merchant shipping, and no tactical or operational brilliance could reverse that fundamental reality. By the end of 1944, Japanese maritime transportation had effectively collapsed. The few convoys that still attempted to operate did so with minimal cargoes, traveling circuitous routes that sometimes doubled voyage lengths in futile attempts to avoid submarine concentrations. Japanese industrial production had declined to a fraction of previous levels, with many factories operating only intermittently when minimal raw materials became available. Food distribution networks had broken down, creating regional famines that claimed hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Japanese military forces deployed across the Pacific had become isolated garrisons, cut off from reinforcement or evacuation, gradually withering as supplies dwindled and combat reduced their numbers. The Japanese still possessed millions of soldiers, thousands of aircraft, and substantial naval forces, but lacked the maritime transportation capacity to deploy these forces effectively or sustain them in combat. The submarine campaign had achieved what surface naval battles and strategic bombing alone could not accomplish: the systematic destruction of Japanese capacity to wage war. American submarines had not needed to defeat Japanese naval forces in decisive battle, had not needed to occupy Japanese territory, had not needed to destroy Japanese industrial infrastructure directly. Instead, they had simply interdicted the maritime supply lines that connected Japanese military forces to industrial base and connected industrial base to raw materials. By cutting these supply lines, submarines had strangled Japanese war-making capacity at its source, making eventual defeat inevitable, regardless of Japanese determination to continue fighting. The sailors who conducted this campaign rarely spoke of it in grandiose terms. For them, it was a job that required technical proficiency, physical endurance, and mutual support. They calculated firing solutions, maintained equipment, stood watches, and executed attacks with professional competence. The strategic significance of their work was something they understood intellectually but rarely dwelled upon emotionally. They knew they were helping to end the conflict, knew their effectiveness was saving American lives by shortening the duration of fighting. Beyond that, most focused on the immediate challenges of their work and the bonds they formed with fellow submariners. The submarine force developed an extraordinary culture of mutual respect and shared purpose, understanding that their survival and success depended on every crew member performing their duties with consistent excellence. Commander Cutter received the Navy Cross for his role in the attack on Convoy HI-72 and subsequent operations. The citation commended his tactical skill, aggressive leadership, and contribution to the campaign against Japanese shipping. For Cutter, the medal represented recognition not just of individual achievement, but of the entire submarine force's collective effectiveness. He understood that his success depended on intelligence officers who provided convoy routing information, on torpedo technicians who had finally made weapons reliable, on industrial workers who built submarines and maintained supply chains, on cryptanalysts who broke Japanese codes, and on fellow submarine commanders who had developed and refined the tactics that made coordinated attacks possible. The medal honored all these contributions through recognizing one visible representative. After the conflict ended, historians analyzed the submarine campaign's role in Japanese defeat and concluded it had been perhaps the single most effective military operation of the entire Pacific conflict. American submarines, which never numbered more than 2% of American naval personnel, had accounted for more than 55% of Japanese merchant shipping losses, totaling approximately 5 million tons destroyed. This destruction had directly caused the collapse of Japanese industrial production, the isolation of Japanese military forces, and the starvation of Japanese civilian populations. The campaign had achieved these results while suffering relatively light casualties, with 52 American submarines lost throughout the entire conflict, compared to more than 1,000 Japanese merchant vessels destroyed. No other weapons system or military operation had achieved comparable strategic impact with such economy of force. The Japanese recognized after the conflict that their failure to defend merchant shipping had been a strategic catastrophe from which recovery was impossible. Japanese naval doctrine had emphasized decisive battle between surface fleets, viewing merchant protection as secondary to achieving tactical supremacy. This doctrinal emphasis meant that resources that might have built escort destroyers instead built battleships, that tactical training focused on surface engagement rather than anti-submarine warfare, that operational planning prioritized fleet concentration rather than convoy defense. When American submarines demonstrated that maritime transportation was the critical vulnerability, Japanese forces lacked the doctrine, equipment, and training to respond effectively. By the time Japanese leadership recognized the magnitude of the threat, the submarine campaign had already achieved irreversible damage, had already severed the supply lines that connected Japanese military forces to their industrial base. The legacy of the submarine campaign extended far beyond the immediate conflict. Post-conflict analysis, by both American and foreign naval forces concluded that modern submarine warfare had fundamentally changed naval strategy, making surface control of sea lanes insufficient without simultaneous control of subsurface approaches. The effectiveness of coordinated submarine tactics, enabled by secure communications and intelligence advantages, became standard doctrine for submarine forces worldwide. The campaign demonstrated that maritime transportation was a critical vulnerability for any nation dependent on seaborne trade, leading to substantial investments in anti-submarine capabilities and convoy protection systems. Perhaps most significantly, the campaign proved that wars could be won through systematic economic strangulation rather than climactic battles. That patient application of force against supply lines could achieve strategic objectives that direct assault might never accomplish. For the veterans who participated in the submarine campaign, the memories remained vivid decades later. They remembered the cramped quarters and oppressive heat, the tension of approaching attack positions, the violent shock of torpedo impacts, the satisfaction of confirmed destruction results. They remembered shipmates who never returned from patrol, 52 submarines lost with all hands, more than 3,500 submariners who died in service. They remembered the extraordinary bonds formed with fellow crew members, relationships forged under conditions that demanded absolute mutual trust. Most of all, they remembered the sense of purpose that sustained them through months of dangerous patrols, the knowledge that their work was directly contributing to ending the conflict, that every merchant vessel destroyed shortened the time until victory and peace. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.